Orcs. J.R.R. race created by Melkor in Tolkien's fictional Middle-earth universe. Orcs are depicted in the novels The Silmarillion and The Lord of the Rings as a race used by the dark forces Morgoth, Sauron and Saruman as soldiers and servants in the Hobbit novel. Orcs are the main enemy, Tolkien's influences. Orc is a name inspired by the Old English word Orkneys. In the Beowulf saga, Orkneys is described as one of the races descended from Cabal in the section where Grendel is introduced in a letter written in 1954. Tolkien used the word orc to mean devil, citing the similarity of sound with other similar meaning words in the languages of Middle-earth that he had invented as the reason for his preference for this meaning. English Latin, god of the underworld, in 1954. In an article he wrote on the elven languages, Tolkien gives the word orc his evil spirit or bogeyman, the origin of the Old English word orcus. The word orc has taken the form of ogre in other European languages, such as French, and has been used to describe a giant-like creature. A description by Tolkien about the goblins in the Hobbit novel is as follows. They're not directly based on my personal background, but I think I owe a lot to goblin culture. I've never believed in it, especially George MacDonald's, except for Lightfeed, various names of orcs in Middle-earth. In Quenya, the language of the High Elves, orcs were called Urko, plural Urqui, meaning bogeyman or nightmare. This word has a meaning that provokes fear. In Sindarin, the language of the Grey Elves, the singular of the name Orch is used as the plural of Yrch. In Khuzd-dûl, the language of the dwarves, the singular Rooks is known as the plural Rakas. The Drúdain or savage language uses the word Gorgon, while the black language of Mordor uses the word Uruk, for example, Uruk-hai, meaning orc people. Orc is the version of the same name used in the Rohirric language. Hobbits also use this name because of their distant relative Rowan, however. The roots of the word in both Rohirric and Hobbit go back to the Elven languages. The names Uruk and Uruk-hai have been used over time to name the Uruk, a subset or group of orcs, who call other orcs who are weaker than themselves Snoggaslaves. The Grey Elves call all of the orcs Glamheth nosy community at once. For the first time, the word goblin was used for the orcs mentioned in the Hobbit novel. In the history of Middle-earth, an orc leader named Bulldog is mentioned. That later the name Bulldog is referred to as a term for or related to a subset of orcs, rather than being a person name. Orcs, goblins and uruks. In Tolkien's works, the name of goblins is mentioned for the first time in the poem Goblin Feet, published in 1915. This is also his first published work. The poem appears in the annual issue of Oxford Poetry, printed by Blackwell's. In the poem, goblins are described as wild jennies. About 45 years later, Tolkien would exclude this poem as childish. In the Book of Law Stories, the names orc and goblin are used to name the creatures that fought the elves and captured them. According to Christopher Tolkien, in the story of Tinville, the author publicly differentiates between goblins and orcs, while in the story of J.R.R, the two names are synonymous. A community called Gonds is referred to as different from orcs in some places, and as a subspecies of orcs in some places. Christopher Tolkien states that Gonds are dark creatures. Their kinship with orcs is hardly known to other peoples. Goblins and orcs are referred to as Melkor's creatures in some places, while in some places they are depicted as independent creatures. The word orc means monster, devil in the Quenta lexicon, which is about 1915, while the name orc means a goblin, a member of the Orc clan in the Gnomish lexicon, which is about 1917, while the name Gon is defined as a description of the goblin in the form of a goblin, a member of the Orc clan. Christopher Tolkien also states in the relevant dictionary that the word gnome, which would later become Noldor, is a derivative whose word origin is based on the word goblin. In The Hobbit, the people of the Smoky Mountains, who captured the dwarves for trespassing on their land, and later in the War of the Five Armies against humans, elves and dwarves, the same people are referred to as goblins. This designation is consistent with the concept in the Book of Law Stories At one point in the novel, Gandalf scares Bilbo with indescribable goblins, hobgoblins and orcs in the wildlings, and at another place. The elvish name of Thorin's sword is differentiated between orc and goblin by the word orcarist. While orc is generally used in The Lord of the Rings, the word goblin is mostly used in the conversations of hobbits. The second part of the novel contains the parts in the Two Towers, where the word goblin is preferred to distinguish Saruman's Uruks from ordinary orcs. There were 54 soldier goblins, big-sized, dark, slant-eye, thick-legged and wide. They had short swords with wide faces. Along with these swords, they did not have curved machetes on them. Normally seen on orcs, they had bows of the same height and shape as people's bows. Also, there was a large goblin's head on a stake in the middle. The white mark could still be distinguished on the shattered helmet of the head. As far as can be understood from the white mark mentioned in the text, the decapitated goblin was an Uruk. According to Tolkien, Saruman's Uruks were marked with an elven rune, the equivalent of which was S. Tolkien also wrote the following note, which appears in some editions of The Hobbit. Orc is not an English word. It appears in a few places, but is usually met with the word goblin or hobgoblin for its larger species. Orc was a name that hobbits gave to these creatures at that time. The word orc, which has little to do with orc, was a name given to dolphin-like sea creatures. In the early drafts of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the word goblin was used everywhere, while the word hobgoblin was used for bigger and meaner goblins. While researching the possible origins of the word hobbit, Tolkien realized that he had made a mistake in the sense he had assigned to the word hobgoblin. The prefix hob was traditionally used not to denote larger beings, but rather to denote smaller beings. In his post-Lord of the Rings writings and many of his articles, including The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, published with the peoples of Middle-earth, Tolkien preferred the orc spelling of the word. When written in orc form, the adjective form of the word is written in Orcish form and read as Orci. Tolkien did not want the K sound of the word to be transformed into an adjective as per second. He wanted the adjective to be read as Orcus if the noun is written as orc. The adjective form is also written as orcish and read as /o/rkish/. Physical appearance of goblins. Goblins are depicted as humanoids with ugly bodies and dirty teeth. The largest are human-sized, but they are usually shorter than the average human height, and can even be as short as a hobbit in The Lord of the Rings. Frodo and Sam disguised themselves as orcs to hide their true identity from the orcs, according to the concept of opposition, based on the physical appearance of human-orc hybrids depicted as human-sized, goblin-faced. It normally results that orcs are shorter than humans. However, some orcs are wide-bodied, although they are not tall. Many orcs, like monkeys, have long arms. Many of them have crooked legs and hunched backs. The color of their blood is black, reminiscent of the reanimated dead. Tolkien clearly depicts orcs in one of his letters with the following words: short, wide-bodied, flat-nosed, pale-faced, wide-mouthed and slant-eyed. Obviously, to the European eye, they are inferior and more unlovely versions of the Mongols. In response to the characterizations that the opinion quoted above is racist, the Tolkien scholar Stuart Jensen wrote in his publication entitled Tolkien Newsgroup's FAQ as follows: at first glance, this comment seems obviously racist, but the fact that he has used the characterization through European eyes puts the comment in a different frame. Tolkien clearly reveals with this that different cultures have different criteria for beauty, and their impressions do not harbor any subconscious sense of superiority. Moreover, Tolkien states that the orcs are not really of the Mongolian type, but are a vile and disgusting humanoid race. However, says Jensen, the assessment made by Tolkien is undoubtedly behind the sensibilities of today. According to the comment made by the Tolkien Michael Martinez in his free copyrighted ebook Parma and Dorian, which offers guidance and information about Middle-earth, Tolkien, he needed a human type that became monstrous and deviant when it was removed from its true appearance and degraded. In fact, Many Asian cultures present evil gods and demons of a similar type. I think Tolkien's choice was inspired not by racism, but by a vast mythological understanding. Martinez also defends the idea that Tolkien's orcs were inspired by the Huns in the historical context, in terms of being marauding and hostile communities in Middle-earth. Considering that Tolkien wrote his writings from a Western point of view, this point of view does not seem surprising given that the Huns and the Mongol Empire entered Europe. Nevertheless, it has been suggested by some that The Lord of the Rings depicts Western white European peoples as good, while those with brown skin and ugly ones are bad. Stoer Jensen argues in the Tolkien Newsgroup's FAQ that reading Tolkien in this way leads to the deciphering of the symbolization of the battle between darkness and light as a racial struggle between white and black from the wrong point of view. Deciphering the symbolization of the war between darkness and light, Jensen also, in Tolkien, blackness, whiteness, light chromaticity, dark chromaticity, etc., he emphasizes that skin color is not the determining criteria used specifically to distinguish between good and evil, and that people with dark skin who serve Sauron, Haradrim actually serve Sauron reluctantly, not with an evil inclination in their hearts. In addition to all this, Tolkien personally said about racism, "If I have contributed in any way to the idea of a racist doctrine that is far from scientific and completely harmful, I should regret it." Types of orcs. Compared to other Middle-earth races, the subspecies of the orc race shows more differentiated characteristics. The most obvious example is Uruk. The Uruk-hai race is bigger, stronger and blacker skinned. The Uruks call other smaller and weaker orcs Naga slaves. Aside from their appearance, changes are also observed among the species of orcs in terms of their characteristics. Saruman's Uruks are highly skilled soldiers, while a weaker type of orc, also called sniffers, has the qualities of a tracker in The Return of the King. One of them is mentioned to be tracking hobbits, with two Uruks next to him. The Uruk of Saruman are taller and more human-looking than the Uruk of Sauron. The Uruks of Sauron, on the other hand, have longer arms. For example, the Ugluk mentioned in The Two Towers. Saruman Uruks are more resistant to sunlight. In the history of Middle-earth, Tolkien mentions the existence of some Maya embodied in the form of orcs, known as bulldogs. Saruman has bred orcs of his own devising. Aragorn says he has never seen one of them before. Tolkien writes in the chapter Myths Revisited of Morgoth's Ring that Saruman produces man-orcs and orc-men. It is not clearly stated whether the Saruman Uruks are a hybrid of Highlanders and orcs. However, the orc-men, also known as half-orcs and goblin men, are hybrids. The orcs were originally subject to Morgoth and Angband. Tolkien mentions in some of his notes that the orcs founded some kingdoms after Morgoth. They later became subject to Sauron in Mordor. Some of them served Saruman in Isengard in the War of the Ring, when Sauron lost the ring to his enemies at the end of the Second Age. Some orcs ran independent businesses at a time before them. Events described in The Hobbit took place. The orcs captured Mount Gundabad and made it their capital. The orcs were organized independently until Sauron reappeared. Orcs of the Smoky Mountains, a period under the leadership of the Great Goblin. The orcs of Moria lived for a period under the leadership of Azog and then his son Bolg. And the orcs of the Gram Mountains lived for a period under the leadership of Golfimbol, with whom they attacked the Shire together. Orc culture. Tolkien does not go into detail about orc culture and things. Orcs are also known to have some kind of healing culture. The Orc Union that kidnapped the hobbits applies a harsh healer to Merry's wound. Orcs' armor, although not as high quality as that of elves, is of useful durability. His wedges and arrows are poisonous according to Aragorn when treating Sam's wound. Sam was lucky not to get a poison stab wound. The orcs had shot Isildur with poison arrows. They like to sing terrible songs as in The Hobbit. The Smoky Mountains goblins are a type of tiny built orc that can design torture instruments and lethal items. Nutrition culture. In The Hobbit, Tolkien depicts orcs as always hungry. However, considering the style of the work, It is unclear whether this is an exaggeration. Orcs eat all kinds of meat, including horses and humans, although there is no definite statement that orcs also eat their own species. There are implicit statements that orcs can also eat their own species. In the third part of the Two Towers, Grishnak, the leader of the Mordor orcs, accuses the Saruman Uruks of eating orc meat, while his interlocutor angrily denies it. From this it seems that cannibalism is a taboo in orc society, or that orcs consider eating their own species as a vile diet or stupidity, because it weakens their own species. Shagard of Sirathun Golu exits by telling his interlocutor that Frodo, lying on the ground in a poisoned state, should be a stew, and that he himself should be a stew. It is known that orcs make a stew-style dish from here. Later, Shagard will see no problem licking the orc blood in his wedge, which can be considered some kind of cannibalism. In a subsequent incident, Shagard threatens a disobedient Snogga to eat him. However, this threat is probably an expression of resentment. Language. Orcs do not have their own language. They use corrupted versions of words compiled from various languages, since each orc community has a polish that is very differentiated from the other. There is no common Orcic language used. For this reason, they use a rough dialect of the common language as a common colloquial language. The Orcic words mentioned in The Lord of the Rings come from the Black Tuniji Gash, fire, Sharku, old man, Snogga, slave. The word Turk from Gondor comes from the common language, and originally from the word Quenya Tarkal nobleman. When Sauron returned to Mordor in the Third Age, his servants and the commanders of his armies in Barad-dûr began to use the Black tongue. There is a sentence in the Two Towers that exemplifies the common use of the Black language. Grishnak of Mordor insults Ugluk of Isengard. Ugluk u Bagron Shah Pushtug Saruman Glob Bub Hosh Sky, in the peoples of Middle-earth. Tolkien translates the sentence as follows: To the dirty cesspool, dear Minur Skun, Big Saruman Fool, Ha. Vinyar Tengwar magazine, which publishes academic analyses on Tolkien languages, recommends the following translation: Ugluk, along with the smelly Saruman filth, to the Minur pit, pig intestines, Ga. There are those who suggest that Tolkien modeled the language of the Hittites and Hurrians on the invention of the Black language. Orcs and Davil regarding the orcs' propensity for good and evil. A piece of information in the Silmarillion gives a clue regarding the Battle of Dagorlit and the subsequent siege of Barad-dûr. All living beings were divided into that day. A part of each species, even quadrupeds and birds, took their ranks in both armies. Except only elves. The elves were under the command of Gil-galad in an undivided state. As for the dwarves, some of them were on the other side, but the relatives of Durin of Moria sided against Sauron. About the Rings of Power and the Third Age. Considering the fact that only the elves are a complete union, based on this, it follows that at least some orcs are fighting against Sauron. But this can still be considered an overinterpretation of the text. It is known that orcs often fight each other, even if not against Sauron. Regarding the winnability of orcs, Tolkien says in the letter, I almost wrote to bad to win, but that would be too extreme. Because by accepting or tolerating their nature, which is necessary for their real existence, even orcs are part of the world that is God's, and thus good in the ultimate sense. It would probably be no worse theology for God to tolerate this than to tolerate the planned monstrosity of people by tyrants today. In Morgoth's Ring, Tolkien suggests that orcs, while not unwinnable, cannot be won by elves or humans. Tolkien acknowledges that orcs are not inherently evil, but that they are slaves and curlers of Morgoth and Sauron against their will, hating their masters and even themselves, just as they hate everyone else. In one of his articles he wrote, we were all orcs in world war. To the origin of orcs. The origin of orcs is unclear. Tolkien's writings deal with the theme that evil has no ability to create from nothing, and based on this, it is concluded that Vala Morgoth, the person who originally derived the orcs, could not have created them from nothing. Unlike the Orc-Mys Orc Dead in Beowulf, female orcs are not mentioned in any of Tolkien's published works. However, It is stated in the Silmarillion that they are derived from elf and human-like, which implies that female orcs exist. In the Hobbit, the orc Azog has a son named Bolge. In the same work, it is told that just before his encounter with Bilbo, Gollum weighed a young goblin kid. Goblins are a type of orc. In 2002, Tolkien's The Letters of J.R.R., one of his letters not included in Tolkien's, was offered for sale by auction at Sotheby's in 1963. Misses in this letter, written to a man named Munsby, Tolkien confirms the existence of female orcs. The relevant sentences in the letter: there must be orc women. But since orcs are not mentioned much in the stories except as warrior soldiers in the armies, in the service of evil masters, we naturally can't learn much about their lives. There's not much known about it. Descent from the soil. J.R.R. According to the oldest theory put forward by Tolkien, the orcs were derived from stone and slime by the magic of Morgoth in the Fall of Gondolin, which takes place in the Lost Stories Book 2. It is mentioned as they were derived from the slime and warmth of the earth and bred from the heats and slimes of the earth. The Fall of Gondolin is the first fully written Middle-earth story by Tolkien, written in 1917. A hint in the Hobbit novel that they are immortal, or have lived to long, is as follows. The orcs of the Smoky Mountains quickly recognized the long-lost swords, Orcrist and Glamdring. From this, the idea arose that the number of generations that have come and gone since the swords disappear is so small that they cannot forget the appearance of swords in orc memory, or that they do not age after a certain age. But at the time Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, the idea that several thousand years had passed after the events that will be described in the Silmarillion until the events in The Hobbit had not yet been fictionalized. In The Two Towers, Gorbag and Shaggar talk about the Great Siege of the Last Alliance in conversations that Sam can hear, as if they had witnessed that siege thousands of years ago. What is meant by this word Great Siege could also be the siege of Minas Tirith, which was going on at that time, or the siege of Minas Morgul, which happened about 1,000 years ago. As can be understood from the fact that Bolge, the son of Azog, died 140 years after his father's death, orcs live for at least several centuries. This last mentioned theory is also consistent with a piece of information given in the article Myths Transformed in Morgoth's Ring. The lives of orcs are short compared to the Númenóreans. Since the above information about the origin of orcs is mentioned in the Silmarillion, many have accepted this theory as Tolkien's last views. Nevertheless, as it will be seen, Tolkien later expressed different opinions, which, although he does not mention them in his works, his latest stated opinions are more suitable to be considered his last opinions. However, the theory described above is the most compatible with Tolkien's published works. Out of the way Myas. In the Middle-earth Historical Review series, especially in the Myths Transformed section of Morgoth's Ring, there are findings that some orc leaders, such as Bulldog, who lived in the First Age, or the Great Goblin, who encountered Bilbo and his accompanying dwarf caravan, were actually corrupted Myas, that they took on the form of orcs in the material world. Some of these beings may have been dreams or ghosts, but others were undoubtedly diminutive and mocking versions of the original shapes of children. The shapes taken by some of Melkor's servants. Melkor had a large number of Maya at his disposal, and like their masters, they had the power to take visible and perceptible form in Arda. Bulldog is a name that is often mentioned in stories about the war. There is a possibility that Bulldog is not a personal name, but either a title or the name of a species of creature. Orc-shaped Myas, alone, they are less terrible than the Balrogs. Melkor has led many souls astray, some as powerful as Sauron, or less powerful like the Balrogs, the youngest or the ancestors of the orcs. Human-orc hybrid Stoking also notes that Sauron, one of Morgoth's generals, hybridized orcs and humans probably on his instructions when Morgoth was active. It is believed that the Uruk-hai race was derived in this way. This method was later repeated by Saruman during the period of the War of the Ring, so that Saruman made his own hybrids. No doubt in the future, in the Third Age, Saruman rediscovered it, or learned it from books, and his lust for being a master led him to do it. to do his worst job, to crossbreed orcs and humans. After all, it has produced evil, big orcs and unreliable, vile orchidams. Tolkien initially focused on the hypothesis that all orcs are descended from misguided and tortured elves. But later there are interpretations that indicate that he felt dissatisfied with this theory, according to Christopher Tolkien. In his work Morgoth's Ring Myths Transformed, Text 10, at the same time that the Emperor began to delete references to the concept of slaves, he began to search for a new origin for orcs. One of the few problems that Tolkien went to deconstruct the entire Middle-earth universe, the cosmology of Arda and the prehistory of Arda, to solve is the origin of orcs. By extending the origin of humans almost to the date of the awakening of elves, Tolkien probably tried to establish the theory that orcs were a degraded people. Tolkien died before he could complete this new theory, and thus the theory referring to the elven origin of the orcs was processed in the Silmarillion. Creatures with enhanced senses and other assumptions of Tolkien. Orcs are animals in humanoid shapes, which are depicted as being strengthened by the will of the Dark Lord, first Morgoth, then Sauron. Orcs are animals in a humanoid way. It seems that all orcs are connected to the Dark Lord in some way. When their master was defeated, the orcs were surprised, despondent, and scattered by their enemies. When 1,000 years had passed since Morgoth's defeat and expulsion from Arda, the orcs had now lost their small stature and characteristics and turned into quarrelsome tribes. Living in the Smoky Mountains, however, when Sauron returned, the orcs regained some strength. The same degeneration happened again when the last alliance defeated Sauron. When Sauron returned to Couyoutreman as a soul caller, the orcs began to grow stronger again. Influence on other fantastic fictions. Tolkien's orcs made a great impact on fantasy fiction and games after him. These orcs became the forerunners of the orcs and orc-like races in many other fictions. The orcs of Warhammer Fantasy, Forgotten Realms and other games are distinguished from Tolkien's orcs by the fact that they are taller than a human, as opposed to the shortness of Tolkien's. And usually Tolkien's orcs have black skin and yellow eyes, while others' orcs have greenish skin and greenish eyes. C.S. Lewis seems to have made a reference to his friend Tolkien's orcs in The Lion, the Witch and the Closet. When the lion goes to his death at the stone table, the storyteller mentions the names of many creatures that gather round the White Witch, one of which is Orkneys. This name also evokes the Old English Anglo-Saxon term Orkneys. In the Elder Scrolls v. Skyrim, orcs are a race that can be selected by the player. They are different from Tolkien's orcs. In this game, orcs are depicted as intelligent creatures with a human body, developed lower jaws and teeth, green skin and generally black hair. Orcs have small settlements in Skyrim, such as Morkosgr, Gashmuruk. Polygamy is seen. Besides, each orc is a skilled warrior. They use axes in two hands. They make their armor and weapons from their own unique minds, but they are not symbols of evil. They have both good and bad, just like people. Adaptations. It is seen that orcs are featured in many adaptations of Tolkien's works, from movie scenes to video games. The goblins in the 1977 animated adaptation of The Hobbit were depicted in a similar way to those in the works of Maurice Sendak, and the orcs in the 1980 film The Return of the King, the sequel to the aforementioned cartoon, were depicted in the same style. Some adaptations portray the goblins as a different race from the orcs. These allusions can be seen in New Line Cinema's Peter Jackson signed Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, War of the Ring and The Lord of the Rings, to Battle for Middle-earth to real-time strategy games. In the first mentioned game, goblins fight alongside orcs and Uruks, while in the second, goblins can be selected in the game as a separate unit. In the film The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, some Uruks are seen to be born from muddy pits, as if they were in a bag and fully grown. This fiction was used to support Saruman's fiction, that he prepared his army in a short time, even overnight, and not through a long-running process of training soldiers. In the Rise of the Witch King add-on of the Battle for Middle-earth to game, Angmar unit has an infantry class named Gundabad Orcs as a reference to the Orc capital. Mount Gundabad, like the Smoky Mountains goblins, they sometimes ride wargs in battle.